Good morning, everybody. Here with you again on a Saturday morning. First day of February, getting pretty much half the winter over for those of you who don't like winter, which would include me. I mean, it's okay around the holidays. After a while, you're just like, let's get to spring. So today we're going to talk about Nehemiah. And last week we covered Ezra. They were contemporaries working together later on. Ezra came back first. We talked about him last week. I'm not going to really summarize too much of him, but we'll get to him in a little bit later. Ezra and Nehemiah. You know, Ecclesiastes says two are better than one. When one falls, the other's there to pick him up. And if you are in full-time ministry, it's really a good idea to have somebody there, a spouse, another elder, somebody to walk with you and work with you in the ministry. So Ezra and Nehemiah team up later on, and we have, in the beginning of Nehemiah, remember they're in Babylon in captivity, but God has ordained through sovereignly appointing kings like first Cyrus and then Darius and now a man named Artaxerxes, allowing the Jews to go back to their homeland. So Nehemiah is more than likely a wealthy man in Babylon. He's a businessman. And he gets a report of what's happening in Jerusalem in chapter 1, verse 3. Let me read that. A man named Hanani says, "The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." Some people call this identificational repentance. Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem when all these things took place, and they did, as we know, because of the sins, the apostate condition of Israel. But he identifies with his country, his nation, and he weeps and fasts and prays, crying out to God for their deliverance. Now, what is needed here is the appeal to authority. Artaxerxes is the king, and Nehemiah takes some time praying about this, then goes to him, and the king says, "Why are you distressed? Why is your face sad, though you're not sick?" And this is in chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. And he says, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" The king asks his request. Nehemiah says, "I'd like to go there and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The temple is going to be rebuilt. The whole city is going to be renovated." And sovereignly, remember I said this last week, they move, the favor of God moves upon Nehemiah, and he's allowed to go back for a time to administrate and organize this whole renovation process. In Romans 12, Paul talks about the gift of administration, which I believe is a very key gift in the church age. You can have people teaching and prophesying and serving and doing all these things, but it takes someone with a gift of organization, administration, to make the whole thing come together. And this is what Nehemiah has and what he does. So this is the background, and he goes to Jerusalem. Now, Artaxerxes probably had an ulterior motive here. Israel right in the middle of Syria in the north and Egypt in the south, both enemies of Babylon. So he probably wanted a buffer state here as well. If there's an attack, he's got some time to assess it, what direction it's coming from. So Israel's kind of in the way. And that's another reason probably why he just wanted this to happen. But God sovereignly moved on his heart. He didn't really have to do that. So he gives Nehemiah a position. He appoints him deputy governor to Judea, and he gives him a military guard and the power to obtain building materials for the construction of the walls and even probably some houses in the city. Notice, we said last week, Ezra did not petition the king for any kind of military escort, even though he was on the way back to Jerusalem with a lot of gold and silver and would have been vulnerable to attack from bandits. Nehemiah takes it. The king offers it. One person is directed one way by the Lord, another person is directed another way. We can't make a formula and say, well, because they did it, I'm going to do it too. The thing with this is we have to be led by the Spirit. Nehemiah takes the military escort and is brought back to Jerusalem under protection from the king. But when he gets there, in chapter 4, it says enemies are approaching in the form of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, and Tobiah, the governor of Ammon. They oppose Nehemiah. Why? Because they fear their influence is going to be reduced. A lot of times people act out of jealousy and competition. Even in the church age, I found that to be true over my years in ministry. And it's better if we work together and have a spirit of unity, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. Division, schism comes in, and we have to deal with that. So we have, first of all, they have a survey here and a plan in chapter 2 and verse 17. They hear of this plan, and in 19, first of all, they mock and insult Nehemiah and the workers that are coming to rebuild the wall. Taunts, scoffing, these kinds of things. That doesn't seem to influence Nehemiah whatsoever. So then, because they see a growing strength of the Jews as a danger and a threat to themselves, they enlist the aid of neighboring countries. They eventually threaten the workers with death if the work continues. So Nehemiah posts sentinels along the walls to watch for attack. I think we mentioned this last week in Ezra as well. So they have a plan here, eventually changes. And what they eventually do is they give a false report of Nehemiah that he's proclaiming himself as a king, which was not true. Look at chapter 6 and verse 6. Sanballat and Tobiah. It is reported among the nations, and Gashmu says that you and the Jews are planning to rebel. Therefore, you're rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king, according to these reports. Not true at all. Just rumors, gossip, these kinds of things circulate. Nehemiah denies all these things, and in proclaiming himself king, that's not what he's meant there to do. So eventually, the enemies come along, and in verse 10, they enlist a man named Shemaiah, who gives a message to Nehemiah, says, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they're coming to kill you at night. So in other words, what he's saying here is, Nehemiah, flee from this work, go into the temple, hide yourself until things blow over, we'll negotiate, we'll talk, and then you'll be safe. Again, this was a false word. And we even see him in the sense of resisting this. Should a man like me flee, verse 11, and could one such as I go into the temple and save his life? I will not go in. And look at verse 12. Then I perceived that surely God had not sent him, Shemaiah, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Notice the word prophecy. So this Shemaiah was probably saying, God has sent me to tell you this message. They're coming to kill you. Go into the temple and hide there until this blows over. Prophecy really needs to be scrutinized, discerned, and really you need to understand what is the source. Where is it coming from? In this case, it was coming from Tobiah and Sanballat through this man who said he was sent by God. All right. In verse 13, just to reiterate, he was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly in sin, so that they might have an evil report in order to reproach me. So these things are turned away as well. And we have people now during this time, Sanballat, Tobiah have an army around the walls. They're looking for an attack, but they don't go in because of the edict that was given for the Jews to rebuild the walls. But they're probably blocking any provisions coming to the city for Nehemiah and his men. So the people start complaining about this. Doesn't it seem pretty obvious when the enemy comes in, people within the church can panic and begin to complain that their needs are not being met. And a good leader will be motivated to take care of that and deal with that. And this is what Nehemiah does. Remember, Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, is on the scene as well, and he is more than likely giving the true word of the Lord to the Jews. And all these threats and false prophecies, bribery, all these things do not work. And the walls are completed in 52 days, verse 15, chapter 7, verse 15, which is really amazing, remarkable. So we have here the fact that Nehemiah is showing how much of a great patriot he is. High courage, simple piety, believes God, walks in holiness. His prayers, which are sprinkled throughout the book, also reveal a lot about his character. You want to know what people are like? Listen to how they pray. If there's a depth of their prayers, they have a burden, they have a fear of God, you know they're godly people. So this businessman becomes a politician, if you will, and deputy governor, and his life is ordered by prayer, and he also understood human nature better than Ezra. What did Ezra do? He plans to remove families from one another. A Jewish man needs to separate from a heathen wife, and the kids involved as well. That was Ezra chapter 10. We saw that last week. I said it was probably the right move because the law forbade mixed marriages. And yet, Ezra was just too radical. What does Nehemiah do? He encounters the same thing when he leaves to go back to Babylon, gives a report to Artaxerxes. Then later he comes back to Jerusalem to assess what's happened. You know what's happened? Mixed marriages again come into play. But he doesn't respond the same way Ezra does, separating the families. He just says, if the family is intact and they're worshiping other gods and full of idolatry, they cannot be part of us in what we're doing for the Lord. So there is a separation, but the families stay intact, which was probably a better move. We see eventually Ezra is coaxed out of retirement by Nehemiah, who needed his services. Ezra is a priest, a rabbi, a teacher of the law. Nehemiah is not that. And together, they make the law an individual matter in Judah rather than just a constitutional instrument on a national level. In other words, they reduced the law to each individual person. Ezra is the one who reads the law. Remember, they didn't have printing presses or anything like that, can't hand out copies. He reads the law probably more than one time, as it says in Nehemiah 8, he read it, but it probably was frequent, because that's how the people were going to know what the law entailed. And he is very much instrumental here in this book as well. So they work together, and Nehemiah's name, by the way, means the Lord comforts. So this careful organizer, given political power, a good leader, knows how to motivate the people, And I think a good leader also can be judged by how he or she confronts crises and reacts to opposition. It tests character. Nehemiah doesn't fear. He stands resolutely in the word of God, rebuild the walls. He resists any attack of the enemy. You know, if you've got something from God, a mandate from the Lord, and you get opposition from the enemy, the best thing you can do is rest in the Lord and in what he has said to you. If you react out of, panic or anything like that, you're playing into the enemy's hands. So Nehemiah simply rests in the Lord and his word. As believers, the word is important when we are under attack. That's when you can quote things like, by the word of our testimony, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, we overcome him, the devil. He's given us, he being the Lord, authority and power to tread upon serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall injure us. These kinds of scriptures, he disarmed principalities and powers, made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through himself. When you speak the word like that, the enemy flees because he doesn't want to be reminded of his destiny, the lake of fire, what the Lord has, dictated for him. So when you stand on the word and you proclaim the word out of your mouth, the enemy flees. So this is what happens here. They rebuild the wall. The Feast of Tabernacles is celebrated, and the people come together. There's joy, there's thanksgiving. All of these are taking place, a higher standard of godliness. And think about this. They're still under the subjugation of the Persians, meaning they don't have freedom. So the two working together, Ezra, the priest, rabbi, scholar, Nehemiah, the deputy governor, the political, the organizer, come together and they see Israel continue to go forward. So that's the story of these two. And, I think the church really can learn a lot from these books, Ezra and Nehemiah. We need to guard against carelessness. That's what got the Jews in captivity. We need to guard against depression when the enemy tries to come in and wear us down. We need people, leaders, to stand firm in the Lord, put on the whole armor of God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So this is the story here, and it sets a seal upon all the accuracy of this. The Jews escape all these things from their enemies. They're allowed to return to their land in anticipation of a coming Messiah, which doesn't happen for quite a long time, but at least their lives are lining up with what God meant for them to be. It's all about covenant, folks. Staying in covenant relationship, abiding in the vine, resting in the Lord, living for him. When you do that, you will prosper. The enemy will not have anything in you. All right, so that's the word here today for Nehemiah. Next week, we'll conclude these books with the story of Esther. Very important book as well. Until then, see you next time.